At 6:03 in the morning, the knocking didn't sound like a neighbor. It sounded like paperwork wearing a badge. When I looked through the peephole, the deputy wasn't alone because my parents were across the street, watching like they had bought tickets to my humiliation. That was when I realized this wasn't a family argument anymore. This was a coordinated takedown, timed for the 1 hour of the day when most people are too groggy to fight back. Leilani Henderson is my name. And until 6:03 this morning, I thought I was waking up to a standard Tuesday. The pounding hit the front door in hard, official bursts that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into the frame of my bed. It was not the rhythmic, polite knocking of a neighbor returning a misdelivered package, nor was it the hesitant tap of a solicitor unsure if anyone was home. This was the knuckle-heavy percussion of authority. It was the sound of a fist that knew it had the law backing every strike. I woke instantly. There was no groggy transition, no slow blink against the morning light. My eyes snapped open, and my body went rigid under the duvet. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a primal biological reaction to a threat invading the sanctity of my nest, but my face remained perfectly still. I had trained myself for years to disconnect my internal panic from my external expression. I took one long, silent inhale through my nose, forcing the oxygen down into my diaphragm, willing my pulse to slow. Panic is a luxury I cannot afford. Panic makes you sloppy, and sloppiness is exactly what the world waits for. I turned my head to the digital clock on the nightstand. The red numbers read 6:03 in the morning. I stared at the time for a split second, analyzing it. 6 in the morning is a specific choice. It is not an accident. It is the tactical hour. It is the time law enforcement chooses when they want to catch a person before their defenses are up, before the coffee has brewed, before the brain has switched from the vulnerable logic of dreams to the hard armor of wakefulness. It is an hour designed to maximize disorientation. I slid out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. I did not reach for a robe. I grabbed the oversized cardigan draped over the chair and pulled it tight around me, buttoning it quickly. I moved through the hallway with the silence of a ghost. Stepping over the creaky board I had memorized years ago, the pounding came again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice that was muffled by the heavy oak of the door but unmistakable in its cadence. It was a shout, but a bored one. A shout that had said the same words 1,000 times before. I reached the entryway and stopped. I did not ask who was there. I leaned forward and pressed my eye to the brass peephole, letting the fisheye lens warp the world outside into a circular, distorted reality. The man standing on my porch was wearing a tan uniform. The badge on his chest caught the gray, flat light of the early morning. He held a metal clipboard in one hand. His posture relaxed. His weight shifted to one hip. He was not poised for a fight. He was poised for paperwork. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a patrol car. The lights were off. The engine was silent. There was no siren, no flashing urgency. This was a civil matter, handled with the quiet, crushing weight of bureaucracy. But the deputy was not alone. My gaze shifted past his shoulder, across the dew-slicked asphalt of the street. To the opposite sidewalk, 2 figures stood there, framed by the neighbor's hydrangea bushes, even through the distortion of the peephole. I knew them better than I knew my own reflection. My parents were standing near the mailbox. My mother had her arms folded tight across her chest, clutching her elbows as if holding herself together, or perhaps holding something in. She was wearing her good coat, the navy blue wool one she usually saved for church or funerals. My father stood next to her, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his chin jutting out. They were not looking at the deputy. They were staring straight at my front door. They were watching the wood as if it were a theater screen, waiting for the curtain to rise. They did not look worried. They did not look like parents concerned about a police presence at their daughter's home. They looked like ticket holders who had arrived early to ensure they had the best view of the demolition. A cold sensation, sharper than the morning air, washed over me. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a wellness check. This was an execution. I pulled back from the peephole and unlocked the deadbolt. I did not take off the chain yet. I cracked the door 3 inches, just enough to speak, just enough to be heard, but not enough to be vulnerable. "Can I help you?" I asked. My voice was raspy from sleep, but steady. I hated the rasp. I wanted to sound like iron. The deputy looked down at me. He was older, with the tired eyes of a man who spent his mornings ruining people's days. He did not smile. He did not apologize for the hour. He looked at the clipboard, then back at me. "Leilani Henderson," he asked. It was not a question. It was a verification. "Yes," I said. He shifted the clipboard and pulled a thick packet of stapled papers from underneath a metal clip. "I have a writ of possession regarding this property," he said. His tone was flat, reciting a script. "Eviction order has been signed by the judge. Enforcement is effective immediately. You have until 12 noon to vacate the premises, or the locks will be changed and your personal property will be moved to the curb." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and absurd. Eviction, writ of possession, vacate. I stared at him. The words made no sense. I own this house. I pay the property taxes. I pay the insurance. I have the deed locked in a fireproof box in the closet 10 feet away. There is no landlord to evict me. There is no bank to foreclose on me. The house is fully paid off. An inheritance left to me directly by my grandmother. I did not scream. I did not slam the door. I did not shout that he was wrong. I knew, with a sickening clarity, that arguing with the man holding the badge is the fastest way to lose. He is not the judge. He is the hammer. You do not argue with the hammer. You find the hand that swings it. "Let me see the paperwork," I said. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, surprised perhaps that I wasn't crying or yelling. He slid the packet through the crack in the door. I took it. The paper felt cold and damp, likely from sitting in the patrol car all night. I scanned the top page. The headers were bold and black. Superior Court, unlawful detainer, writ of possession. I scanned down to the names of the parties. Plaintiff: Robert Henderson and Martha Henderson. Defendant: Leilani Henderson. My parents were the plaintiffs. My parents were evicting me from the house I owned. I looked up from the paper, my eyes locking onto the deputy's face. I saw his gaze flick over my shoulder, not looking at the interior of my house, but looking past me, through the crack in the door, aiming for the reflection in the hall mirror, or perhaps just avoiding my eyes. Then, he looked past me entirely, his eyes darting toward the street where my parents stood. It was a quick look, a micro-expression. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. It was a look of recognition. He knew they were there. He expected them to be there, and in his eyes, there was no pity for the woman being thrown out of her home in her pajamas at 6 a.m. There was a dull, transactional acknowledgement. He had spoken to them. Perhaps they had met him at the end of the block. Perhaps they had pointed out the house. He looked back at me, his face closing up again. "You need to sign the receipt of service," he said, holding out a pen. I looked past him, pushing the door open wider now, disregarding the chain. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold concrete biting into my bare feet. I looked directly at my parents. They saw me emerge. My mother took a half-step forward, then stopped. My father uncrossed his arms. They did not wave. They did not come running up the driveway to ask what was wrong. They stood their ground, anchored by the mailbox. "You forced us to do this." "Leilani!" my mother shouted. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the morning silence. It was a projected voice, pitched perfectly so the neighbors on either side would hear it. It was a line of dialogue from a soap opera. I stood still, the paperwork clutching in my hand like a weapon I didn't know how to use yet. "We tried to be reasonable," my father added, his voice booming. "You wouldn't cooperate. This is for the family. For the family." The phrase twisted in my gut. They were evicting me for the family. I looked back at the deputy. He was waiting, pen hovering. He wasn't stopping them. He wasn't telling them to keep it down. He was letting the theater play out. I realized then what was happening. This wasn't just about removing me from the house. If they just wanted me out, They would have filed a lawsuit and fought me in court properly. They would have sent letters. This, the 6 a.m. knock, the surprise deputy, the screaming from the sidewalk. This was shock and awe. This was designed to break me psychologically before I could even access my logic. They knew me. They knew I was careful. They knew I kept receipts. They knew I had the deed. So they couldn't win a fair fight. They had to win a fast one. They had timed this for the one moment when I would be most vulnerable, hoping I would crumble, hoping I would start screaming back, hoping I would throw clothes into a bag and run away in shame. They wanted me to scramble. They wanted me to be so busy reacting to the humiliation that I wouldn't have time to look at the paperwork. Because if I looked at the paperwork, I might see the lies. I took the pen from the deputy. My hand was steady. I signed the receipt of service. My signature a sharp, jagged line. I handed the clipboard back to him, but I kept the packet of papers. 12 noon. The deputy repeated, "That is 6 hours. I suggest you get moving." He turned and walked back to his patrol car. He didn't look at my parents again, but he didn't have to. The transaction was complete. I stood on the porch for one more moment. The wind was picking up, blowing my hair across my face. My mother was still watching, waiting for me to break. She wanted tears. She wanted a scene. She wanted me to run across the lawn and beg her to stop. She wanted the satisfaction of forgiveness, the power of being the benevolent matriarch who could call off the dogs if only the ungrateful daughter would kneel. I did not kneel. I did not cry. I did not give them a second of what they wanted. I looked at my mother, locked eyes with her across the distance, and then I stepped back inside and closed the door. I locked the deadbolt. I slid the chain in place. The house was silent again. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the peaceful silence of my home. It was the suffocating silence of a crime scene. I leaned my back against the door and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. I placed the packet of papers on the hardwood in front of me. 12 noon. 6 hours. My parents thought this was the end of the story. They thought the badge and the shouting would be enough to crush me. They thought Leilani Henderson was just their daughter, the one they could bully, the one they could manipulate. They forgot who I really was. I am not just a daughter. I am a person who documents everything. I am a person who survives. I picked up the first page of the eviction order. I ignored the shaking in my hands and focused on the text. I needed to see how they did it. I needed to see the mechanism of the trap. I checked the timestamp on the judge's signature. It was dated 5 days ago. 5 days. They had held this. They had waited. They had let me sleep in this house for 5 nights, knowing a sheriff was coming, just so they could maximize the surprise. I looked at the address of service. I looked at the description of the property. My mind began to list what I needed to document. Step 1. Photograph the deputy's car as it drives away. Step 2. Photograph my parents standing outside. Step 3. Scan every page of this packet. Step 4. Find the deed. Step 5. Check the court docket online. The panic was still there, a cold knot in my chest. But the machine in my brain was waking up. The gears were turning. They wanted a scramble. I would give them a war. I stood up, clutching the papers. The floor was cold. But I didn't feel it anymore. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the coffee maker. I would need the caffeine. Through the kitchen window, I could see the silhouette of my parents still standing there. They were talking to each other now, probably congratulating themselves on a job well done. They thought they had won. They thought the deputy was the final word. They didn't know that the deputy was just the opening bell. I poured the water into the machine, listening to the gurgle. I watched the dark liquid drip into the pot. 6 hours. I whispered to the empty room, I can do a lot in 6 hours. I am 34 years old, and I learned a long time ago that in this family, love is conditional, but a receipt is absolute. Most people keep shoeboxes of photos or ticket stubs from concerts they went to in college. I keep filing cabinets. I keep bank statements going back 7 years. I keep email threads saved as PDFs. I keep text messages archived in a cloud server that my parents do not know exists. This is not because I am paranoid. It is because I am observant. I learned to be this way because I was raised by people who treat the truth like Play-Doh, something they can reshape to fit whatever narrative makes them the victim or the hero of the hour. I sat at my kitchen table, the coffee steam rising into my face, and looked around the room. This house is a 2-bedroom bungalow built in 1955. It has good bones, squeaky floors, and a morning light that hits the breakfast nook in a way that makes you feel like everything is going to be okay. But it is not a family home in the sentimental sense. I did not grow up here. My height is not marked on the doorframe of the pantry. This house was my grandmother's sanctuary, and now it is mine. When my grandmother passed away 2 years ago, she did something that severed the final tether of civility between my parents and me. She skipped a generation. She knew her son, my father, better than anyone. She knew that if she left this house to him, he would have sold it within a month to fund some half-baked investment scheme, or to buy a boat he would never use. And the money would have evaporated into the ether of his mismanagement. She knew that if she left it to my mother, it would be used as leverage, a dangling carrot to control me. So she left it to me. She did it through a formal estate plan, a revocable living trust that became irrevocable the moment her heart stopped beating. It was clean. It was legal. It was bulletproof. Or at least, I thought it was. For the last 24 months, my ownership of this house has been the sun around which my parents' resentment orbits. To them, family is not a bond of blood or affection. It is a contract. It is a business arrangement where they are the investors and children are the assets. And eventually, the assets are expected to yield a return on investment. They believe that because they fed me and clothed me and put a roof over my head for 18 years, they possess a lien on my future. They view my grandmother's decision not as a gift to me, but as a theft from them. I remember the first time they brought it up, about a month after the funeral. We were standing in this very kitchen. The air still smelled like the bleach I had used to scrub the counters. My father leaned against the refrigerator, crossing his ankles, affecting a casual tone that I knew was dangerous. He told me that it was a lot of responsibility for a single woman. He said that the market was hot and that we should look into selling it. He used the word we. He said we could split the proceeds fairly. He suggested a 60-40 split, with the larger share going to them because, after all, it was his mother's house, and technically, logically, spiritually, it should have been his. I told him no. I did not shout. I did not get angry. I just said that I intended to live here. That was the moment the word started. Ungrateful. It is their favorite weapon. It is a word designed to bypass logic and strike directly at the guilt centers of the brain. You are ungrateful for everything we sacrificed. You are ungrateful for the car we bought you when you were 16. You are ungrateful for the fact that we exist. Over the last year, that word has appeared in text messages, in voicemails, and in long, rambling emails sent at 2 a.m. They stopped treating me like a daughter and started treating me like a hostile business partner who had hostilely taken over their territory. But I did not just sit here and let the house rot. I made it mine. And because I am who I am, I created a paper trail that is so thick it could stop a bullet. I looked at the walls I had painted sage green 3 months ago. I thought about the receipts scanned into my laptop. I spent $12,000 on a new roof last October because the old one was shedding shingles like autumn leaves. I paid the contractor with a cashier's check from my personal account. I have the invoice. I have the warranty registered in my name. I replaced the water heater in January when it flooded the garage. That was another $1,800. My name is on the work order. My name is on the credit card statement. I pay the property taxes. 2 installments a year, paid directly to the county assessor's office. The checks have Leilani Henderson printed in the top left corner. The insurance policy is in my name, with no additional insured parties listed. I have spent the last year fortifying my claim to this land not just by living on it, but by paying for every single inch of its existence. Every time I swipe my card for a can of paint or a bag of mulch, I was subconsciously building a defense for a trial I didn't know was coming. That is why the last 3 months were so confusing. That is why I almost let my guard down. Around November, the pressure stopped. The angry emails ceased. The passive-aggressive comments about how much the house was worth on Zillow evaporated. My parents started acting strange. They started acting nice. It began with a text from my mother. Just a picture of a cat that looked like one we had when I was a child. No guilt trip attached. Then, an invitation to Sunday dinner. Not at their house, but at a neutral restaurant. My father paid the bill. He asked me how my job was going. He didn't ask for money. He didn't bring up the house. He smiled. He asked if I was dating anyone, but in a gentle way, not the usual interrogative sneer. I was suspicious. Of course, I am always suspicious, but a part of me, the part that is still a little girl wanting her parents to love her, wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that they had finally accepted the reality of the situation. I wanted to believe that they had grieved the loss of the payout they expected, and decided that having a relationship with their daughter was more important than fighting over real estate. We started seeing each other once a week. They would come over for coffee. They would sit on my sofa, the sofa I bought, and compliment the new curtains. They were charming. They were the parents I saw other people having, but looking back now, sitting here with the eviction order on the table, I see the machinery behind the smile. I replay the conversations, and I hear the questions differently. 3 weeks ago, my mother asked me casually about my work schedule. She asked if I was still going into the office early on Tuesdays. She said she worried about me driving in the dark. I told her yes. I usually leave by 7. I thought she was being maternal. Now I know she was establishing a timeline. She needed to know when the house would be empty, or when I would be asleep, or when I would be most vulnerable to a surprise attack. 2 weeks ago, my father asked if I was still getting any lingering mail at their house, the house I grew up in, the house I moved out of 10 years ago. He said he thought he saw something from the bank. I told him no. I changed all my addresses years ago. He pressed. He asked if I was sure. He asked if maybe I had used their address for anything official, just as a backup. I told him no. I realize now he wasn't trying to forward my mail. He was checking to see if I was monitoring that mailbox. He was checking to see if I would notice if something legally significant was delivered there instead of here. They were not rebuilding a relationship. They were building a case file. They were lulling me into a false sense of security so that I would stop looking over my shoulder. They needed me calm. They needed me to stop talking to my lawyer. They needed me to think the war was over so that they could position their troops for the final assault. The chilling truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. This was not an emotional outburst. This was not a crime of passion. This was premeditated administrative violence. My parents do not want to talk me out of the house. They realized that arguing with me was useless because I have the will and the trust document on my side. They realized that they could not bully me into selling, so they decided to change the reality on paper. They want to paperwork me out of it. They understood something about the American legal system that most people miss. The system does not care about truth initially. It cares about process. If you can make the paperwork look right, if you can check the correct boxes on the correct forms, you can move the machinery of the state against anyone. You can get a badge and a gun to show up at a door at 6 in the morning and enforce a lie, provided that the lie is stamped by a clerk. I looked down at the writ of possession again. The deputy said the judgment was entered by default. That means I didn't show up to court. I didn't show up because I didn't know there was a court date. I didn't know because I wasn't served. But my parents knew. They knew exactly where the notices went. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet. I pushed aside the winter coats and the vacuum cleaner. I knelt down and pulled out the fireproof safe bolted to the floorboards. I spun the dial. Left to 30, right to 15, left to 42. The heavy door clicked open. Inside were the vitals of my life, my birth certificate, my passport, and the blue folder containing the deed and the trust documents from my grandmother. I pulled the folder out and held it to my chest. This was the shield, but a shield is useless if you don't raise it in time. I carried the folder back to the kitchen. I checked the time on the microwave. 6:30. I had lost 27 minutes to shock and coffee. I could not afford to lose another second. The emotional stakes were no longer just about the house. If they succeeded, if they actually managed to kick me out and change the locks. They wouldn't just take the property, they would take my sanity. They would prove that their version of reality, the one where I am an incompetent child who needs to be managed, was the truth. They would validate every criticism, every insult, every time they called me ungrateful. Losing this house would be the death of my independence. It would force me to crawl back to them, or to scramble for a rental I hadn't budgeted for, destabilizing the life I had so carefully built. I touched the surface of the table. It was solid oak. I paid $400 for it at an estate sale and refinished it myself. I sanded it down. I stained it. I sealed it. I put the work in. They think they can take it because they feel entitled to it. They think that because they are my parents. The laws of gravity and property do not apply to them. They think they can forge a narrative and the world will just nod along. I opened the blue folder and spread the real deed out next to the eviction order. The contrast was stark. One was a document of love and legacy, signed by a woman who wanted me to be safe. The other was a weapon of spite, forged by the people who were supposed to protect me. I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye, hot and sudden. I wiped it away furiously with the back of my hand. I would not cry for them. I would not give them that moisture. I would save my breath for the fight. I am Leilani Henderson. I am independent. I am careful. And I have every single receipt. I picked up my phone and opened the camera app. I started photographing the pages of the eviction notice, one by one, ensuring the text was legible, ensuring the case number was clear. Step 1, preserve the evidence. Step 2, find the lie. Step 3, burn their house of cards to the ground. I looked out the window one last time. The street was empty now. My parents had gone. Presumably to get breakfast and celebrate their victory. They were probably ordering pancakes, laughing about the look on my face when I opened the door. Enjoy your breakfast, Mom and Dad, I said to the glass, because it is going to be the most expensive meal you ever ate. The papers were spread out across my kitchen table like the anatomy of a murder. Except the victim was my life, and the weapon was a stack of legal forms. I had the coffee in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. The steam curled up, disappearing into the cold air of the house I was supposed to vacate in less than 6 hours. I picked up the first sheet again, the writ of possession. In the chaos of the doorway, I had only glanced at the top line. Now, I forced myself to read the fine print. The deputy had been the messenger. But this document was the voice of the court. It confirmed the plaintiffs in black and white, Robert Henderson and Martha Henderson. Seeing their names typed there, formalized in the upper left-hand corner where a bank or a property management company usually sits, made my stomach turn over. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a declaration of war. They hadn't just sued me, they had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was a trespasser in my own home. I pushed that page aside and dug for the one document that mattered most. The question burned in my throat, the same one I would have screamed at the deputy if I hadn't been so stunned. Where was I served? In the United States. You cannot take someone's home without due process. You have to notify them. You have to hand them a complaint. You have to give them a chance to fight. I had received nothing. No certified mail. No process server at my door. No sticky note on the gate. The first time I knew about this case was when the badge showed up at 6:03 this morning. I found the document titled, Proof of Service of Summons. My eyes scanned down to the section marked Address of Service. I expected to see a mistake. I expected to see a typo. Or perhaps the address of a neighbor who had thrown the papers in the trash. What I saw made the breath hiss out of my lungs. The address listed was 1242 Oak Street. I haven't lived at 1242 Oak Street in 11 years. It was a duplex my parents bought as an investment property when I was 22. I had rented the top unit from them for 6 months after college before I got a real job and moved as far away as I could afford. They still owned it. They still had the keys. I looked at the method of service. The box for personal service was unchecked. Instead, there was a heavy black X in the box for substitute service. Substitute service means the process server couldn't find the defendant, so they gave the papers to another adult living at the residence. I read the description of the person who accepted the papers. Female, Caucasian, approximately 65 years old, height 5'4", gray hair. I dropped the paper onto the table. It fluttered down, landing crookedly on the oak surface. The adult female occupant was my mother. The realization hit me with the force of a physical slap. My mother had gone to the old rental property, a place where she knew I did not live, and she had waited. She had waited for the process server that she and my father had hired. When he knocked, she opened the door. She pretended to be my roommate, or perhaps she just didn't correct him when he assumed she lived there. She took the lawsuit intended for me. She accepted service, and then she likely walked to the kitchen trash can and threw it away. That was how they got the default judgment. They didn't beat me in court. They made sure I never made it to the stadium. The memory of their voices from the sidewalk echoed in my head. We tried the easy way. This was their definition of the easy way. They bypassed the arguments. They bypassed the messy reality of the trust and the deed. They simply removed me from the equation entirely. They acted as both the plaintiff and the defendant. They sued me, and then they accepted the lawsuit on my behalf. It was brilliant. It was evil. And it was working. But for a default judgment to work, there has to be a basis for the eviction. You cannot just evict a homeowner. You have to prove a landlord-tenant relationship exists. I turned to the next section of the packet, labeled Exhibit A. The header read, Residential Lease Agreement. I stared at it. I felt the blood drain out of my face, leaving my skin cold and prickly. I do not have a lease. I have a deed. I have never paid rent to my parents for this house because I own it. Yet, there it was. A standard, store-bought rental contract. The terms were generic. Month-to-month tenancy. Rent set at $2,000. The start date was listed as 1 year ago. I scanned to the bottom of the page. There were 2 signature lines. The first was signed by my father, Robert Henderson, in his heavy, blocky script. The second line was signed by Leilani Henderson. I leaned in closer, my nose almost touching the paper. The signature spelled my name. It had the general shape of my handwriting. The capital L was looped, the way I used to do it in high school. But the flow was wrong. It was too hesitant. The ink was darker in some spots, lighter in others, as if the hand holding the pen was moving slowly, tracing a memory rather than signing a name. It was a forgery, and not just a forgery, it was a sloppy one. It looked like the kind of signature my father would make if he were trying to copy my signature from an old birthday card. My brain went cold. The panic that had been fluttering in my chest suddenly froze into a hard, jagged block of ice, up until this second. I thought I was dealing with a family dispute. I thought I was dealing with overbearing parents who were manipulating the system. I was wrong. I was dealing with criminals. This wasn't just lying. This was perjury. This was forgery. This was filing false instruments with a government body. My parents hadn't just tried to trick me. They had committed felonies to steal my house. They had sat at their dining room table, the one with the lace runner, and they had drafted a fake lease. My father had taken a pen and signed my name. My mother had driven to the old rental unit to intercept the process server. They had coordinated this. They had planned it. They had looked each other in the eye and agreed that sending their daughter to the street was worth the risk of prison. I looked at the papers again, but I didn't see legal forms anymore. I saw a weapon, a jagged, rusty knife they had twisted into my back while smiling and inviting me to Sunday dinner. The deputy's words from the doorway came back to me, clearer now than when he had spoken them. He hadn't just given me the deadline. He had given me a lifeline. Though he had buried it in official language, if you believe this is improper, you need to file an emergency motion. Today, he had known. When he saw my parents standing across the street, when he saw the look on my face, he must have smelled the rot in this case. Deputies serve writs all day long. They know what a deadbeat tenant looks like, and they know what a victim looks like. He couldn't give me legal advice. That would cost him his badge. But he had given me the procedure. Emergency motion. I looked at the clock. It was now 6:45 in the morning. The courthouse didn't open until 8:30. I had less than 2 hours to build a defense against a lie that had been 6 months in the making. I didn't feel the need to cry anymore. The sadness had evaporated, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt dangerous. They wanted to play with paper. They wanted to use the court as a weapon because they thought I was too weak to wield it back. They thought Leilani Henderson was just a name on a page they could scribble over. I stood up and walked to the counter where I kept my laptop. I opened it, the screen glowing blue in the dim kitchen. I am not a lawyer. I am not a fighter. But I am the daughter of Robert and Martha Henderson. And if they taught me one thing, it is how to hold a grudge. They had forged my name. They had stolen my identity to accept service. They had lied to a judge. I cracked my knuckles. I wasn't just going to stop the eviction. I was going to make sure that the next time a deputy knocked on a door before sunrise, it wouldn't be at my house. I pulled the proof of service closer to the keyboard. I needed to type out an affidavit. I needed to swear under oath that I was not at 1242 Oak Street. I needed to swear that the signature on Exhibit A was a fraud. My parents had bet everything on the idea that I would crumble. They bet that the shock of the sheriff would paralyze me. They forgot that paper cuts go both ways. The deputy had drawn a heavy, invisible line in the sand, and that line was 12 noon. It was not a suggestion. It was a cliff edge. If I did not have a court order in my hand by the time the sun hit its zenith, the locks would turn, and I would be on the wrong side of the door. Most people, faced with that kind of temporal wall, would panic. They would start throwing clothes into suitcases, grabbing photo albums, trying to save the soft things. They would waste precious minutes crying over a vase or a sweater. I did not touch a single piece of clothing. I did not look at the keepsakes on the mantel. I turned into a machine. Panic is a chaotic energy, and right now, I needed a laser. I needed to document the crime scene before I could fight the crime. I laid the pages of the eviction packet out on the kitchen table. The lighting was getting better as the sun rose, but I turned on the overhead lights just to be sure. I held my phone steady, breathing out before I tapped the shutter button to ensure there was no shake. I photographed the case number first, then the judge's signature, a scrawl of black ink that had authorized this nightmare. I photographed the service address, 1242 Oak Street, making sure the numbers were sharp and legible. I photographed the substitute service checkbox. I photographed the forged lease. I did not just keep the images on the phone. I uploaded them to a cloud drive. Then I emailed them to myself. Then I emailed them to a secondary email address I had not used since college. Redundancy is survival. If my phone fell in a puddle or got lost in security, the evidence would still exist. Then I went to the safe again. I did not need the whole archive. I needed a strike team. I pulled out a slim black plastic folder. Into it went my driver's license, which listed my current address, the correct address. Next, I added the utility bill from last month, showing electricity usage at this house, paid by me. Then the homeowner's insurance declarations page, listing Leilani Henderson as the sole insured. Then the property tax statements for the last 2 years. Finally, I added the recorded deed summary and the estate distribution documents from my grandmother's trust. These were not just papers. They were my identity. They were the proof that I existed in this space legally. My parents had a story. I had the receipts. I sat by the phone. The court clerk's office opened at 8:30 in the morning. It was 8:15. Those 15 minutes were longer than the entire 34 years of my life. I watched the digital clock on the microwave flip. 8:16, 8:17. The silence of the house was heavy, amplified by the knowledge that outside, the world was moving on, completely unaware that my life was being dismantled. At 8:29 and 50 seconds, I dialed the number. I listened to the automated greeting, my finger hovering over the keypad, waiting for the option for the civil division. As soon as the voice said press 3, I hit the button. I expected a long hold time, but the universe gave me a small mercy. The ringing stopped, and a human voice answered, Superior Court, Civil Division. This is Janice. I did not cry. I did not scream that my parents were stealing my house. I kept my voice flat. Procedural. stripped of all vibration. If I sounded emotional, I was just another drama in her day. If I sounded professional, I was a problem to be solved. "Good morning, Janice," I said. "I am calling regarding case number 492761. I have just been served with a writ of possession for this case, but I was never served with the original complaint. I need to verify the status of the judgment." I heard the clicking of a keyboard on the other end. It was a dry, rhythmic sound. "One moment," she said. "Okay. Henderson versus Henderson?" "Yes. I see a default judgment was entered last week against the defendant, Leilani Henderson." Hearing it out loud was like swallowing glass. Last week, while I was at work, while I was cooking dinner, a judge had banged a gavel and ended my ownership. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "Can you please verify the address of service listed in the file?" "Let me check the proof of service." Janice said, "It shows service was completed at 1242 Oak Street." I let the silence hang for exactly 2 seconds. "I am the defendant," I said, slowing my cadence down so every word landed like a brick. "I do not live at 1242 Oak Street. I have not lived there for 11 years. That address is owned by the plaintiffs." The clicking stopped. There is a specific silence that happens when a bureaucrat realizes something has gone wrong. It is the silence of a gear slipping. The proof of service says substitute service was accepted by... Janice's voice trailed off. She was reading the description. She was doing the math. By an adult female occupant. I finished for her. "I live alone at the property in question, which is not the address listed on that form." Janice's tone shifted. The boredom vanished. She was not just talking to a caller anymore. She was talking to a procedural error. "Ma'am, if you were not served properly, you need to get down here immediately. I am on my way." I said, "I need to know exactly what to file to stop the sheriff. The deputy said I have until 12 noon. You are cutting it close," she said. But it was not a scold. It was a warning. "You need to file an ex parte application for a stay of execution and a motion to set aside default judgment. Do not go to the general filing window. Go straight to the civil clerk's window on the 2nd floor. Ex parte stay. Motion to set aside." I repeated, writing the words down on the back of a utility bill envelope. "Which department is this assigned to?" "Department 44. Judge Alvarez." I wrote it down like it was the code to a bomb shelter. "Department 44. Judge Alvarez." "Thank you, Janice. Good luck," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. I did not leave yet. I had one more call. A court order is just a piece of paper if the guy with the gun does not know about it. I dialed the sheriff's civil unit. "Civil unit. Sergeant Miller." "Sergeant, I am the defendant in an eviction scheduled for enforcement today at 12 noon. I am heading to court to get an emergency stay. If I get the stay signed by the judge at 11:50, how do I get that information to the deputy on the street before he breaks my door down?" "You get the signed order," Miller said, his voice gruff but helpful. "You do not wait for the clerk to update the system. You take a picture of the judge's signature on the order. And you call this number back. We will give you an email address to send it to instantly, or we will patch you through to the field deputy's radio. But you need that paper in your hand. Understood?" I said. I hung up. I grabbed the war folder. I grabbed my car keys. The microwave clock read 6:45. It was 8:45 in the morning. I had 3 hours and 15 minutes to drive across town. Navigate security, file a motion, get a hearing, convince a judge, and get a signature. I walked out the door, locking it behind me. I checked the handle 3 times. It might be the last time I ever locked it, or it might be the start of the longest day of my life. I got into my car, the engine turning over with a roar that matched the adrenaline flooding my veins. I did not look at my parents' house across the street. I did not look at the mailbox. I looked at the road. I was not driving to work. I was driving to war. The fluorescent lights of the county courthouse hummed with a sound that felt like a drill pressing directly into my temple. I stood at the viewing window of the records division, my hands resting on the cold laminate counter. The air smelled of toner dust, floor wax, and the specific, stale anxiety of people whose lives were being dismantled by bureaucracy. I had requested the full case file for Henderson versus Henderson. I did not want the summary. I did not want the docket sheet. I wanted the physical pile of paper that my parents had submitted to a judge to convince him that I was a stranger in my own home. When the clerk slid the file across the counter, it looked deceptively thin. It was a manila folder, perhaps half an inch thick. It seemed impossible that my entire existence as a homeowner, my financial stability, and my sanctuary could be erased by such a small stack of wood pulp. I opened it. The top documents were the procedural ones I had already seen. The writ of possession, the default judgment. I flipped past them, my fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon looking for a tumor. I needed to see the exhibits. I needed to see the evidence. Exhibit A was the lease. I pulled the page out and laid it flat. Seeing it in the stark lighting of the courthouse was even worse than seeing it in the dim morning light of my hallway. It was laughably amateurish. It was a single page, the kind of generic rental agreement you can buy at an office supply store for $2 or download for free from a legal template website. The terms were filled in with a typewriter, the font misaligned with the printed lines. Who uses a typewriter in this decade? My father does. He keeps an old Olivetti in his study because he doesn't trust printers. I read the clauses: month-to-month tenancy, rent due on the 1st, no pets. I almost laughed. I have a cat. My parents know I have a cat. If this were a real lease, my father would have included a pet deposit clause just to be difficult. But the thinness of the lie was not what made my blood run cold. It was the arrogance of it. They hadn't even tried to make it look authentic. They assumed that because I wouldn't show up to court, because they had ensured I wouldn't know about court, no one would ever read this document. It was a prop, not a contract, and then there was the signature. I stared at the bottom of the page. Leilani Henderson. The ink was blue ballpoint. The pressure was heavy, indenting the paper. I looked at my own hand, resting on the counter. I signed my name thousands of times a year at work. My signature has a rhythm. It has a speed. This signature was a drawing. It was a shaky, hesitant attempt to replicate a curve that flows naturally from my wrist. It looked like a child trying to copy a parent's handwriting on a permission slip. A voice spoke from the other side of the glass. "You are the defendant?" I looked up. It was a different clerk than the one I had spoken to on the phone. This one was a young man with thick glasses and a name tag that read David. He was watching me look at the lease. He wasn't looking at me with suspicion. He was looking at me with curiosity. "Yes," I said, "I am the defendant, and I am also the owner of the property." David glanced down at the file, then back at me. He lowered his voice, leaning in slightly, breaking the invisible barrier of neutrality that usually governs these interactions. "If you are the owner," he said quietly, "then the plaintiffs have no standing to evict you. You can't be a tenant in a building you hold the title to." Standing. It was a legal term, dry and academic. But in that moment, it sounded like a choir of angels. Standing meant the right to bring a lawsuit. If my parents weren't the owners, they couldn't be landlords. If they weren't landlords, they couldn't evict. The entire case relied on the premise that they owned the dirt under my feet. But they knew that my father is not a lawyer, but he is a man who obsesses over loopholes. He would know that a lease isn't enough if the public record still lists me as the owner. He would know that the judge might check the property tax rolls. So there had to be something else. I turned the page to Exhibit B. The world stopped. The hum of the lights faded. The chatter of the attorneys behind me turned into white noise. It was a grant deed. I stared at the document, my brain refusing to process the visual information. It was a standard California grant deed. The recording stamp in the top right corner showed it had been filed with the county recorder 3 months ago. Grantor: Leilani Henderson. Grantee: Robert Henderson and Martha Henderson. As joint tenants. The document claimed that on November 15th, I had transferred the title of my home, my grandmother's legacy, my only asset, my fortress, back to my parents. For $0, it was a gift transfer. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me, so violent I had to grip the counter to stay upright. November 15th. That was right in the middle of the nice period. That was when they were inviting me to dinner. That was when my mother was texting me pictures of cats. They weren't just distracting me. They were waiting for the recording period to clear. They were waiting for the title to officially shift in the county database so that when they filed the eviction, the judge would see them as the legitimate owners. They hadn't just faked a lease. They had stolen the house. They had committed grand theft, real estate fraud, and forgery on a massive scale. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. In, out. Do not scream. Screaming gets you escorted out by the bailiff. Analyzing gets you justice. I looked at the signature on the deed. It was the same shaky hand as the lease, but a deed requires more than a signature. It requires a notary public to verify the identity of the signer. You cannot record a deed without a notary stamp. I looked at the bottom of the page. State of California, County of Los Angeles. On November 15th, before me, appeared Leilani Henderson, who proved to me on the basis of satisfactory evidence to be the person whose name is subscribed to the within instrument. The notary's seal was stamped clearly in purple ink. The name was unfamiliar. Sarah J. Miller, Commission Number 2, 14689. I leaned in until my forehead was almost touching the paper. I looked at the handwritten commission expiration date and the commission number written below the signature line. There was a mark. It was tiny. Most people would have missed it, but I am a person who keeps receipts. I am a person who looks for the discrepancy. In the commission number, the fourth digit, a 6, had been written over. Beneath the heavy ink of the 6, I could see the faint, scratched-out line of a different number, maybe a 0, maybe a 5. The notary had made a mistake on her own commission number. A notary public does not make mistakes on their own commission number. That number is their identity. It is stamped on every document they touch. They know it better than their social security number. To write it wrong, and then to scratch it out and correct it with a pen instead of voiding the document and starting over? That smelled of panic. That smelled of someone who was nervous. That smelled of someone who wasn't looking at a commission stamp, but was perhaps copying a number from a text message or a piece of paper, and misread it in the heat of the moment. I looked at the name again. Sarah J. Miller. I didn't know a Sarah Miller. I had never stood in front of a Sarah Miller. And on November 15th, I certainly hadn't signed my house away to the people who were currently trying to break down my door. I looked up at David. The clerk. I need a certified copy of this entire file. I said. My voice was no longer flat. It was cold. It was the voice of someone who has just found the murder weapon, and I need to know where the recorder's office is. Down the hall. Turn left. Room 200. David said. He was looking at me with wide eyes. He had seen the deed. He had seen the look on my face. He knew. Thank you. I paid for the copies with my credit card. Watching the receipt print out, I folded it and put it in my wallet. Every penny I spent today was going to be part of the lawsuit I would file tomorrow. I took the stack of certified copies and walked out of the courtroom, down the long marble hallway. I didn't run, but I walked with a stride that made people step out of my way. Room 200 was the county recorder. This was the library of land ownership. This was where the truth lived, or where lies were memorialized. I walked up to the kiosk. I typed in my parcel number. The screen populated with a list of documents. There it was, the most recent entry, grant deed, November 15th. I requested a certified property record summary. I wanted the full chain of title. I wanted a piece of paper with the county seal that showed exactly when my grandmother gave it to me, and exactly when this fraudulent document claimed I gave it away. While the clerk was printing the summary, I grabbed a blank form from the wall rack. Notice of pendency of action, lis pendens. But I couldn't file that yet because I hadn't filed a lawsuit. I needed something immediate. I needed to stop the bleeding. I found a form called a fraud alert and contested conveyance notice. It was a purely administrative flag. It didn't have the power of a court order, but it put a giant red mark on the digital file. It meant that if my parents tried to sell the house tomorrow, or refinance it to pull out the equity, the title company would see the flag. It would freeze the water. I filled it out with a pen that dug deep into the paper. I, Leilani Henderson, assert that the deed recorded on November 15th is a forgery and was not signed by me. I handed it to the clerk. File this immediately. I said. She looked at the form, then at me. There is a recording fee of $20, she said. I handed her my card. Record it. I watched her stamp it. I watched the time code print on the top. 10:15 in the morning. I had the case file. I had the certified deed history. I had the fraud alert pending. But I needed one more thing. I needed to prove that physically, biologically, temporally, I could not have signed that deed on November 15th. I pulled out my phone. I walked to a quiet corner of the hallway, away from the echoing footsteps. I opened my calendar app. I scrolled back to November 15th. It was a Wednesday. I tapped on the date, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. In office, project review meeting. I worked at a defense contractor. We didn't just have a receptionist. We had a security protocol that would make the Pentagon nod in approval. You couldn't get into the building without a badge. You couldn't get into the elevator without a badge. You couldn't go to the bathroom without passing a camera. I dialed the number for the internal security office at my company. Security, this is Evans. Hi, Evans. This is Leilani Henderson. Employee ID 4992. I have a bit of an unusual request, and I need it for a legal emergency involving identity theft. Go ahead. Leilani, I need a certified log of my badge access for November 15th of last year. I need the entry time at the main gate, the turnstile swipe in the lobby, and any internal door swipes for the entire day, and if you have them. I need the retention footage from the lobby camera showing me entering and leaving. Evans paused. That is a few months back. Leilani, video retention is usually 90 days. We might be right on the edge. Please check, I said. My voice cracked for the first time. Please, it proves I wasn't where they say I was. Hold on. I heard him typing. The silence stretched. I watched the second hand on the wall clock tick. 10:20. The sheriff was probably finishing his coffee right now, getting ready to head to my house. Okay, Evans said. I have the logs. You were here, swiped in at 7:45 in the morning, swiped into the secure lab at 8:10, swiped out for lunch at 12:15, swiped back in at 12:45, swiped out for the day at 6:30 p.m. I let out a breath that felt like it had been held for a year. And the video? I asked. I am checking the archive server. Yes, we have it. It deletes after 120 days. You got lucky. I need you to save it. I need you to burn it to a drive or email me a secure link. And I need an affidavit from you or the head of security stating that these records are authentic and unaltered. I can do that, Evans said. But it will take me an hour to process the video. I don't have an hour for the video. I said, send me the logs now. Just the text logs in a PDF with your signature. I will take the video later. Done. Give me 5 minutes. Thank you. Evans, you have no idea what you just did. I killed the call. I stood in the hallway of the Hall of Records. I had a war folder that was no longer slim. It was heavy with the weight of evidence. I had the forged lease. I had the fraudulent deed with the scratched-out notary number. I had the fraud alert. And in 5 minutes, I would have the digital footprint proving that while my parents claimed I was signing over my inheritance, I was actually sitting in a secure facility 10 miles away. I looked at the directory on the wall. Department 44, Judge Alvarez, 2nd floor. I adjusted my cardigan. I smoothed my hair. I checked my eyes in the reflection of the glass case housing a historical display of the county's first map. I didn't look like a victim anymore. I looked like a prosecutor. I turned toward the elevators. It was time to go to court. Department 44 smelled like floor wax and old decisions. It was a windowless box of wood and fluorescent light, designed to strip away emotion and leave only the dry bones of the law. I sat on the hard wooden bench in the gallery. My hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned the color of parchment. The clock on the wall above the judge's bench read 11:15. I had 45 minutes before the deputy at my house would drill the lock. 45 minutes before my cat was put in a cage and my furniture was hauled to the curb. My phone buzzed in my pocket. probably the sheriff's civil unit or my neighbor asking what was happening. But I did not look at it. I watched the door. At 11:17, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. My parents walked in. They were not wearing the smug expressions they had worn on the sidewalk 5 hours ago. They had undergone a transformation. My mother was wearing a soft, pastel cardigan and sensible shoes. She was clutching a tissue in her hand. Her eyes rimmed with a redness that looked suspiciously manufactured. She leaned heavily on my father's arm, projecting the image of a frail, heartbroken woman who had been pushed to the brink by a cruel child. My father wore a slightly ill-fitting suit, looking stoic and burdened. Walking a step ahead of them was their weapon. He was a man in his 50s, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my car. He carried a leather briefcase that looked soft enough to sleep on. He had the polished, predatory air of a lawyer who specialized in making problems disappear for people who could afford his hourly rate. They saw me. My mother's eyes flickered toward me, and for a split second, the sadness dropped, replaced by a flash of pure, cold anger. Then the mask slid back up. She looked away, dabbing at her dry eyes. The bailiff stood up. All rise. Department 44 is now in session. The Honorable Judge Alvarez presiding. Judge Alvarez was a woman with gray hair pulled back into a severe bun and glasses perched on the end of her nose. She did not look like someone who had time for theatrics. She sat down, adjusted her robe, and looked at the docket sheet. Henderson versus Henderson. She said, ex parte application for stay of execution. I stood up. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced them to hold me. Leilani Henderson, defendant and applicant, appearing in pro per. I said, my voice was steady. The man in the charcoal suit stepped forward. James Sterling, representing the plaintiffs, Robert and Martha Henderson. The judge looked at me over her glasses. Ms. Henderson, you are asking for an emergency stay of a writ of possession scheduled for enforcement at 12 noon today. That is in less than 40 minutes. This court has already entered a default judgment against you. The time to contest this was 20 days ago. Why should I stop the sheriff now? I walked to the podium. I placed my war folder on the surface. I did not look at my parents. I looked at the judge. Your Honor, the enforcement must be stayed because the judgment is void. I was never served with the lawsuit. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. It was a polite, dismissive sound. Your Honor, if I may, he said, his voice smooth as oil. The plaintiffs filed a proof of service showing that substitute service was completed at the defendant's residence on January 10th. We followed all procedural requirements. Ms. Henderson simply chose to ignore the court until the sheriff arrived. This is a delaying tactic. The judge looked back at me. I have the proof of service here. Ms. Henderson, it says you were served. I opened my folder. I pulled out the certified copy of the proof of service I had obtained downstairs. Your Honor, I ask you to look at the address of service listed on line 3. The judge flipped through the file on her bench. 1242 Oak Street. She read, I pulled out my driver's license, my utility bill, and my property tax statement. Your Honor, I reside at 789 Maple Avenue. That is the property currently subject to the eviction order. I have lived there for 10 years. 1242 Oak Street is a rental property owned by the plaintiffs. I have not lived there since 2015. I saw the judge's eyebrows tick upward. She looked at the papers I held up, then gestured for the bailiff to bring them to her. She examined my ID. She examined the bill. She looked back at the proof of service. Mr. Sterling, she said, her tone cooling slightly. Why was service attempted at an address where the defendant does not reside? Sterling didn't blink. My clients believe she was staying there at the time. Your Honor, it is a family property. I didn't let him finish. Your Honor, I continued, my voice gaining strength. Please look at the description of the person who accepted the substitute service. The judge looked down. Adult female occupant, she read. I pointed to the back of the courtroom, directly at my mother. The person who accepted service was the plaintiff, Martha Henderson. She went to her own rental property, met the process server she hired, and accepted the lawsuit intended for me. The plaintiffs served themselves. The courtroom went silent. The air pressure seemed to drop. Judge Alvarez looked at my mother. Then she looked at Mr. Sterling. The look was no longer cool. It was icy. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "did your client sign the proof of service accepting the documents?" Sterling shifted his weight. He adjusted his cufflink. "Your Honor, under the Code of Civil Procedure, substitute service is valid if left with a competent member of the household. Mrs. Henderson was at the property." The judge cut him off. A sharp, chopping motion with her hand. "Counsel, do not quote the code to me. I am asking a simple question. Did the plaintiff accept service for the defendant? Yes or no?" Sterling hesitated. He knew that lying to a judge was a line he couldn't cross, even for a polished fee. "Yes, Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson accepted the papers." The judge leaned back in her chair. She took off her glasses. "So, you are telling me that the people suing to evict this woman are the same people who ensured she never received the lawsuit? That is a fundamental violation of due process. We tried to be reasonable," my mother blurted out from the gallery. Her voice was shrill, breaking the silence. "We tried to talk to her. Mrs. Henderson, silence," the bailiff barked. Judge Alvarez stared at my mother, then turned her gaze back to Sterling. "I am inclined to vacate the default judgment right now. Counsel, this smells like fraud." Sterling raised a hand. He was on the ropes. But he was a fighter. He reached into his briefcase. "Your Honor, while there may be a procedural question regarding service, the fact remains that my clients are the legal owners of the property. We have a recorded grant deed transferring the title from the defendant to the plaintiffs. Even if service was imperfect, the defendant has no right to possession. She is a tenant at sufferance." He pulled out a document. It was the deed I had seen downstairs. The trump card. I knew this was coming. I had prepared for it. But hearing him say it, hearing him claim that I had signed away my grandmother's legacy, made my blood boil. He handed the deed to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. "This deed was recorded on November 15th. Sterling said, "It is a valid transfer. The house belongs to the parents. They have every right to evict her." The judge looked at the deed. She looked at the signature. "Ms. Henderson?" she asked. "Did you sign this?" I stepped up to the microphone. I gripped the sides of the podium. "No, Your Honor, I did not. I pulled out the employment logs I had received from Evans. On November 15th, the date this deed was allegedly signed and notarized. I was at my workplace from 7:45 in the morning until 6:30 in the evening. I work in a secure facility with badge access. I have here the certified entry logs and a sworn affidavit from the head of security proving I was nowhere near a notary public." I handed the logs to the bailiff. The judge took them. She compared the dates. She looked at the times. "Furthermore, Your Honor," I added, playing my own ace, "if you look at the notary acknowledgement on that deed, you will see that the commission number has been altered. The fourth digit is scratched out and rewritten." The judge squinted at the deed. She brought it closer to her face. She saw it. Sterling was quiet now. He hadn't known about the commission number. My parents hadn't told him. Clients lie to their lawyers all the time, and I could see the moment he realized he had been handed a grenade with the pin pulled out. Judge Alvarez looked up. Her face was hard. "Mr. Sterling, this document is highly suspicious, and coupled with the irregular service, I have serious doubts about the validity of this entire action. My parents are the true owners," my father shouted. He couldn't help himself. He stood up, his face red. "She is ungrateful. She is stealing our retirement." "Sit down, sir," the judge snapped. "One more outburst and you will be removed." She turned back to me. "Ms. Henderson, I am granting the emergency stay." I let out a breath. My knees almost buckled. Effective immediately. The writ of possession is recalled. The sheriff is ordered to stand down. She wasn't finished. She turned her eyes that had seen 1,000 lies, onto Mr. Sterling. "Counsel, I am setting a full evidentiary hearing for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and at that hearing, you will produce the original wet ink deed. Not a copy, The original. Yes, Your Honor, Sterling said, his voice tight. And, the judge continued, her voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous, you will also produce the notary public. Sarah J. Miller. I want her in this courtroom. I want her notary journal, and I want to see the entry for this specific transaction. If that journal does not exist, or if the signature in that journal does not match the defendant's ID, I will refer this matter to the district attorney's office before lunch. She slammed the gavel. Hearing adjourned, the sound of the gavel was the best sound I had ever heard. It was louder than the banging on my door had been. Time snapped into focus, too little of it left. 11:35. I had 25 minutes to spare. I turned around. My parents were standing there, looking shell-shocked. They had expected to walk in, have their lawyer say a few words, and walk out with the keys to my house. Instead, they had walked into a buzzsaw. My mother looked at me. The mask was gone entirely now. There was no sadness. There was only fear. She knew what the judge's order meant. She knew that bringing the notary was impossible because the notary was likely a friend of theirs, someone they had coerced or paid off, someone who had broken the law as a favor. Sterling was packing his briefcase furiously. He wouldn't look at them. He was already calculating how to withdraw from the case to save his own license. I picked up my war folder. I didn't say a word to them. I didn't have to. The judge had said it all. I walked past them, down the center aisle of the courtroom. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the hallway. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's civil unit. Sergeant Miller, I said, I have the order. The judge signed it. I am sending you the picture now. Call off your deputy. I heard the radio crackle on the other end. Copy that. Ms. Henderson, we are standing down. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But I couldn't sleep yet. Tomorrow was the real fight. Tomorrow. The notary would have to answer the question that my parents had been avoiding for years. Tomorrow. The lie would die in public. The hallway outside Department 44 was crowded with people waiting for their own tragedies to be called. But the air around my parents felt uniquely toxic. They were standing near the water fountain, huddled with Mr. Sterling, who looked like he was trying to calculate the exact moment he could ethically fire them as clients. I tried to walk past them without making eye contact. I wanted to get to the elevator. I wanted to get out of the building before the adrenaline crash hit me. But my mother has a radar for my presence. She did not shout this time. The performance of the weeping, heartbroken mother was over because the audience, the judge, was no longer watching. She stepped into my path. She was close enough that I could smell her perfume, a floral scent that used to remind me of safety but now smelled like deception. She did not reach out to grab me. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a register that was barely audible over the hum of the courthouse ventilation. You have no idea what you just started, she hissed. It was not a warning. It was a promise. Her face was dry, composed, and utterly cold. The mask had slipped completely. There was no trace of the woman who had texted me cat pictures 3 months ago. There was only the woman who had signed for my eviction notice and thrown it in the trash. I did not stop walking. I did not hiss back. I did not give her the satisfaction of a retort. I kept my eyes forward, stepping around her as if she were a pylon in a parking lot, and pressed the down button on the elevator bank. I waited until the metal doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of her face, before I let my shoulders drop. Her words rattled in my head. You don't know what you started. She was right. I didn't know the full extent of it yet, but she was wrong about one thing. I wasn't the one who started it. I was just the one who was going to finish it. I did not go home immediately. Home was the target. Home was where the sheriff had been. Home was where the threat was centered. I needed to be sure that the battlefield was prepped before I returned. I went back to the recorder's office. I had filed the fraud alert earlier that morning, but filing something and seeing it on the record are two different things. In the digital age, A lag of 2 hours can mean the difference between keeping your house and losing it to a quick flip sale. I walked back to the kiosk and typed in my parcel number again. The screen refreshed. There it was. Notice of pendency of action/fraud alert. Recorded at 10:15 in the morning. It was a red flag in the system. It meant that if my parents tried to run to a title company this afternoon to sell the house to an investor for cash, the title officer would pull the report, see the flag, and shut the transaction down. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, but in real estate law, a recorded lien is a better weapon. I printed the screen just to have a physical copy, time-stamped and undeniable. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an email notification. The subject line read, "Security logs, priority request." It was from Evans, the security chief at my office. I opened the attachment on my phone. Squinting at the small screen, Evans hadn't just sent a summary. He had sent the raw data dump, formatted into a clean PDF with a digital signature verification. I scrolled to November 15th. The data was beautiful. It was granular. It was indisputable. 0745. Employee 4992 enters main gate. License plate scan confirmed. 0752. Employee 4992 badge swipe. Lobby turnstile. B. 0810. Employee 4992 badge swipe. Secure lab door 4. It went on like that for the whole day. But Evans had gone a step further. He had included the parking gate exit logs. 0632. Employee 4992 exits, main gate. The deed my parents had submitted, the one with the scratched-out notary number, claimed I had appeared before a notary in a different city on that same day. Unless I had learned to bilocate, or unless I had a body double with my exact retinal scan. The story my parents told the court was physically impossible. I forwarded the email to my personal account. Then I forwarded it to the secondary archive account. Then I saved the PDF to the files on my phone. I drove home. The street was quiet. The patrol car was gone. The neighbors' sprinklers were ticking back and forth in a lazy rhythm. My parents' car was not in their driveway across the street. They were likely still with their lawyer, or perhaps regrouping at a diner to plan their next move. I walked up to my front door. The lock was still intact. The deputy hadn't drilled it. The stay had worked. I went inside and locked the door behind me. The house felt different. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a fortress under siege. I didn't take off my shoes. I didn't turn on the television. I went straight to the hardware store bag I'd picked up on the way home. I had bought a new lock, not a fancy smart lock that could be hacked, but a heavy-duty deadbolt with a reinforced strike plate. I got my toolbox. I removed the old lock, the one my parents might still have a key to. I worked quietly. I didn't use a power drill that would whine and alert the neighborhood. I used a manual screwdriver, turning the screws with steady, silent pressure. I replaced the hardware, fitting the new brass cylinder into the door. I tightened the screws until they bit into the wood. Click, the new bolt slid home. Then I took out the camera. It was a small, battery-operated unit with a magnetic base. I didn't mount it on the front porch where it could be seen and smashed. I mounted it inside the living room window, tucked behind the curtain valance, pointing out at the driveway and the front walk. The lens was invisible from the outside, but it had a clear view of anyone approaching the door. I synced it to my phone. The feed went live. I saw my own car in the driveway. I saw the empty street. I saw the enemy's camp across the road. I sat down at the kitchen table. The sun was going down. The shadows were stretching across the floor, turning the sage-green walls into a dark, moody gray. My phone buzzed again. It wasn't an email this time. It was a text message. The number was unfamiliar. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't my father. It was a local area code, but the number looked generic, likely a burner or a prepaid phone. I opened the message. The text was short. "You think you are clever. You will lose more than a house if you show up tomorrow. Drop it." I stared at the screen. My heart did a slow, heavy thump in my chest. This was the escalation. This was the psychological warfare phase. They knew the legal ground was crumbling beneath them. They knew the notary journal wouldn't hold up. So they were moving from fraud to intimidation. Lose more than a house. It was vague enough to be plausible deniability. They could claim they meant I would lose my family, or my reputation, but specific enough to trigger fear. It implied physical danger. It implied that the cost of fighting was higher than the value of the real estate. I did not reply. I did not type, "Who is this?" or "Go to hell." Replying validates the threat. Replying tells them you are reading it and that you are affected. I took a screenshot of the message. I opened my email. I created a new draft. Subject: Threat received. Case number 492761, body. Received at 7:15 p.m. from telephone number 555-0199. Text implies physical or personal harm if I attend the hearing tomorrow. I attached the screenshot. I sent it to myself. I sent it to the folder labeled Evidence. Then I turned off the notifications for that number. I didn't block it. If they sent more threats, I wanted to receive them. I wanted to capture every single word. But I wouldn't let the phone buzz and spike my cortisol levels again. I went to the kitchen and made a sandwich. I wasn't hungry. The bread tasted like sawdust and the turkey tasted like nothing, but I forced myself to eat. A soldier doesn't eat because the food is good. A soldier eats because the engine needs fuel. I sat at the table with a pad of yellow legal paper. I needed to simplify. The judge had seen the chaos today. Tomorrow. She needed to see the narrative arc. I needed to draw a straight line through the maze of lies my parents had constructed. I uncapped a black marker. Entry 1. Service fraud. Description: January 10th. Plaintiff Martha Henderson impersonates a resident at a rental property she owns to accept service for me. Entry 2. Default judgment. Description: Entered due to lack of response, based on the fraudulent service. Entry 3. Writ of possession. Description: Issued based on the default, the weapon used to force the eviction. Entry 4. Forged lease. Description: Exhibit A. Generic template. Signature does not match. Entry 5. Fraudulent deed. Description: Exhibit B. Recorded November 15th. Claim transfer of title. Notary commission number altered. Entry 6. The alibi. Description: November 15th. Security logs prove I was at work, 10 miles away, behind 3 layers of security, during the alleged signing. Entry 7. The threat. Description: Text message received tonight. Intimidation witness tampering. I looked at the list. It was 7 steps, 7 distinct acts of malice. It wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a criminal enterprise. I tore the sheet off the pad and placed it on top of the war folder. This was my opening statement. My phone flashed 8:45, 9:30. I needed to sleep. My body rebelled at the idea. My brain was spinning at 4,000 revolutions per minute. I was replaying the look on my mother's face. I was imagining the notary lying on the stand. I was wondering if someone was going to throw a brick through my window. But exhaustion makes you sloppy. Exhaustion makes you emotional. If I walked into court tomorrow with red eyes and a shaking voice, I would look unstable. I would look like the hysterical daughter my parents were trying to paint me as. I needed to look like a glacier. Cold, hard, immovable. I walked through the house, turning off the lights one by one. I checked the new lock on the front door. I checked the back door. I checked the window latches. I went into my bedroom. I pulled the blackout curtain shut, ensuring not a sliver of street lamp light could get in. I placed my phone on the nightstand. Face down, charging. I lay down in the dark. I focused on my breathing. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. I wasn't sleeping because I felt safe. I didn't feel safe. I felt like I was sleeping in a trench. But I slept because my parents were counting on me to be tired. They were counting on me to be too wrecked to fight. I closed my eyes. I would wake up at 6. I would shower. I would put on my best suit. And then I would go to court, and I would burn their lie to the ground. The bailiff unlocked the doors to Department 44 at exactly 9 in the morning. The air inside the courtroom felt different than it had the day before. Yesterday, it had been a place of administrative boredom, a place where paperwork was shuffled and dates were set. Today, it felt like an operating theater where a patient was about to be cut open to see if the cancer had spread. I took my seat at the defendant's table. I had my war folder open in front of me, arranged with the precision of a surgical tray. To my left, the plaintiff's table was a study in tension. Mr. Sterling sat with his back rigid, his expensive suit looking like armor. My parents sat next to him, but they were no longer huddled together. They sat with a distinct gap between them, staring straight ahead, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at the gallery, refusing to look at the woman sitting in the front row behind them. That woman was Sarah J. Miller. The notary public looked nothing like the monster I had built up in my head during the sleepless hours of the night. She was a woman in her late 40s with frizzy hair pulled back in a clip and a cardigan that was buttoned wrong at the bottom. She held a thick black ledger book against her chest with both arms, clutching it as if it were a life preserver in a stormy sea. She looked nauseous. She looked like a woman who had woken up realizing that a favor she did 3 months ago was about to cost her everything. Alvarez's courtroom swept into the room. The bailiff called for order. We all stood. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor was the only noise in the room. "Please be seated," the judge said. She did not look at the docket. She did not look at the other files on her bench. She looked directly at Mr. Sterling. "Counsel," she said, "do you have the document?" Sterling stood up. He did not offer a preamble. He did not offer an argument. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not a photocopy. It was the original grant deed. "Yes, Your Honor." Sterling said. "Approach," the judge commanded. Sterling walked to the bench and handed the document up. The judge took it. She put on her glasses. The room held its breath. I watched her eyes scan the paper. I watched her tilted under the light. She was looking for the scratch. She was looking for the alteration I had pointed out on the copy. She lowered the paper and looked at the gallery. "Sarah Miller, please step forward and take the stand." The notary stood up. Her purse strap caught on the armrest of the bench. She fumbled with it, her face flushing a deep, blotchy red. She walked through the swinging gate, her heels clicking unevenly on the floor. She climbed into the witness box and raised her right hand. Her hand was shaking so badly that the bailiff had to ask her to keep it steady. "Do you swear to tell the truth? The whole truth? And nothing but the truth?" "I do," she whispered. "State your name for the record." "Sarah Jean Miller." Judge Alvarez turned her chair to face the witness box. She did not ask Sterling to question his witness. She took over the inquiry herself. This is what happens when a judge suspects fraud. They stop being referees and start being inquisitors. "Ms. Miller," the judge began, her voice deceptively calm. "I have in front of me a grant deed recorded on November 15th of last year. It transfers property from Leilani Henderson to Robert and Martha Henderson. Does this document bear your signature and official seal?" The bailiff handed the deed to Sarah. She looked at it for less than a second. She didn't need to look. She knew what it was. "Yes, Your Honor, that is my signature. And did you notarize this document on the date indicated?" "Yes." The judge leaned forward. "And did the grantor, Leilani Henderson, appear before you in person on that date?" "Yes," Sarah said. The answer came too quickly. It was a reflex. It was the answer she had practiced in the car, or the answer she had told herself so many times that she hoped it would become true. The judge paused. She let the word "yes" hang in the air, allowing it to ripen and rot. "How did you verify the identity of the signer?" the judge asked. Sarah blinked. She licked her lips. "Driver's license," she said. She showed me her California driver's license. I sat perfectly still. My own driver's license was sitting on the table in front of me. Next to the security logs, the judge extended her hand. "Please hand your notary journal to the bailiff." Sarah hesitated. For a fraction of a second. She looked toward the plaintiff's table. She looked at my father. My father was staring at the wall, studying the wood paneling with the intensity of a man trying to disappear. He did not meet her eyes. He left her stranded on the island. Sarah handed the black book to the bailiff. The bailiff walked it up to the bench. Judge Alvarez opened the book. She flipped through the pages. The sound of the paper turning was loud in the quiet room. November 15th, the judge read. Here is the entry. Grant deed. 11:15 in the morning. She looked up at the witness. Ms. Miller, you recorded the driver's license number of the signer in this column. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. The judge read the number aloud. D4922781. I looked down at my license. My number starts with D7. The judge looked at me. Ms. Henderson, please hand your identification to the bailiff. I did so. The bailiff carried my license to the judge. She compared the plastic card to the handwritten entry in the journal. She didn't speak for a long moment. She just looked from one to the other, then back at the notary. The numbers do not match. Ms. Miller, the judge said. In fact, they are not even close. The number in your journal has too many digits for a California license issued in the last 10 years. Sarah started to sweat. I could see the sheen on her forehead under the harsh courtroom lights. I must have written it down wrong, she stammered. It was a busy day. I might have transcribed it incorrectly. A clerical error, the judge said, her voice flat. Let's look at the physical description. Your journal lists the signer as 5'4" with brown eyes. Judge Alvarez's gaze cut to me. Ms. Henderson, please stand up. I stood. I am 5'9". I was wearing 3-inch heels, making me toweringly tall. I have green eyes that are light enough to be noticed from across a room. The judge looked back at the notary. Ms. Miller, the woman standing in this courtroom is clearly not 5'4". She is not the woman described in your journal. So I will ask you again. Who appeared before you on November 15th? Sarah gripped the edge of the witness box. It was her. She insisted, but her voice was thin. She was wearing flat shoes. Maybe I guessed on the height. I don't measure people. You don't measure people, the judge repeated, but you are required by law to verify identity. You are the gatekeeper of the public record. Your Honor. I said. Her eyes pinned me in place. I have evidence regarding my location at the time entered in that journal. Proceed. The judge said. I picked up the security logs Evans had sent me. I walked them to the bailiff. Your Honor, the journal states the notarization took place at 11:15 in the morning on November 15th. I have submitted certified security logs from my employer, a defense contractor with secure facility access. I pointed to the highlighted line on the page. At 11:15 in the morning on that day, I was inside a secured laboratory. The logs show I swiped in at 8:10 and did not swipe out until 12:15 for lunch. The facility is located in El Segundo. Ms. Miller's office is in Pasadena. That is a 45-minute drive. I turned to look at Sarah Miller. Unless I can teleport, it is physically impossible for me to have been in your office signing that deed. The judge looked at the logs. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the notarization time. She closed the journal. The sound was like a gunshot. Ms. Miller, the judge said. Her voice was no longer questioning. It was final. The journal time is specific. The security logs are specific. Reality is specific. You cannot have two truths in the same space. The judge leaned over the bench, staring down at the woman in the witness box. I am going to remind you that perjury is a felony. I am going to remind you that falsifying a public record is a felony. And I am going to remind you that right now, you are the one holding the bag for a fraud that benefits the people sitting at that table. She gestured toward my parents. Did Leilani Henderson sign that document in your presence? Sarah looked at the judge. Then she looked at the logs. The geometry of the lie had collapsed. There was no room left to maneuver. There was no clerical error that could explain away a 20-mile distance and a fake ID number. She looked at my parents again. My mother was gripping her purse, her knuckles white. My father was still staring at the wall. They were not going to save her. They were going to let her go to prison to protect their narrative. Sarah Miller made a sound. It was a half sob, half gasp. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it hit the walls of the courtroom and bounced back with the force of an explosion. Excuse me? The judge asked. No, Sarah said louder. She didn't sign it. She wasn't there. The courtroom froze. The stenographer stopped typing. Mr. Sterling closed his eyes and lowered his head, knowing his career was flashing before his eyes. Tell me what happened, the judge ordered. They brought it to me, Sarah said, the words spilling out in a rush now that the dam had broken. Bob and Martha. They came to my office. They said Leilani was busy. They said she couldn't get off work, but she had already signed it at home. They said it was just a family transfer, just moving money around for taxes. They said it was urgent. She started to cry. I've known them for 10 years. She sobbed. They said it was a favor. They said I would be helping the family. I stamped it. I wrote down a fake number just to fill the line. I didn't think anyone would check. It was just a house. Just a house. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. To her, it was just a house. To me, it was my life. She had been willing to destroy my stability because she didn't want to say no to a friend. The judge looked at Sarah with an expression of profound disgust. You violated your oath, Ms. Miller. You fabricated a public record, and you enabled a fraudulent conveyance of real property. The judge turned her gaze to the plaintiff's table. My parents were frozen. My mother's mouth was slightly open. My father looked gray. The Concerned Parents Act was gone. They were exposed. They weren't the victims of an ungrateful daughter. They were the architects of a criminal conspiracy. Judge Alvarez picked up her gavel. She didn't bang it yet. She held it, suspended, like the sword of Damocles. Stand up, Mr. Sterling. Sterling stood up. He looked sick. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this. I was relying on the documents provided by my clients. I believe you. Counsel, the judge said, because if I thought you knew, you would be in cuffs right now too. She turned to the court clerk. The court finds that the grant deed recorded on November 15th is a forgery and is void ab initio. The default judgment previously entered is hereby vacated immediately. The writ of possession is dissolved. The eviction case is dismissed with prejudice. She wasn't done. This is no longer a civil matter. This is potential criminal conduct. I am ordering the bailiff to take possession of the notary journal and the original deed as evidence. I am referring this entire transcript to the district attorney's office for investigation into forgery, filing false instruments, and perjury. She looked at my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. You are lucky I am in a civil division and do not have the power to arrest you from the bench. But do not leave town, and do not, under any circumstances, go near that property or the defendant. She looked at me. Her expression softened. Just for a moment. Ms. Henderson, you have your home back. The record is cleared. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. My voice was steady, but my knees were shaking. Court is adjourned, the judge said. She slammed the gavel down. The sound was final. It was the sound of the end. Sarah Miller was weeping into her hands. The bailiff was moving toward her to secure the journal. Mr. Sterling was packing his briefcase with frantic speed, not saying a word to my parents. My parents sat there. They looked small. They looked old. For the first time in my life. I didn't see the giants who controlled my world. I saw two people who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. I picked up my war folder. I didn't look back at them. I turned and walked out of the swinging gate. I walked down the aisle. I pushed open the doors. The hallway was bright. The air was breathable. I had walked in as a defendant. I was walking out as the owner. The sound of the gavel striking the wooden block was the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the cleanup. In the movies, the hero walks out of the courtroom into the sunlight and the credits roll. In real life, when you win a legal battle, you do not walk into the sunset. You walk to the clerk's window to buy the paper that proves you won. I stood in line at the Civil Division filing counter. My hands were no longer shaking, but they felt heavy, as if the adrenaline that had been holding them up had suddenly evaporated. I watched the clerk, a woman named Patricia, who looked like she had seen every variety of human misery. Take the file from the bailiff. I need certified copies of the minute order and the judgment. I said, "How many?" she asked. 5, I said. It was an excessive number. Most people only need one. But I was not most people. I was a woman who had almost lost her home because of a lack of paper, and I was never going to be caught short again. I wanted a copy for the recorder, a copy for the sheriff, a copy for my safe, a copy for my lawyer, and a copy to tape to the inside of my front door, just in case anyone ever knocked again with a clipboard. I paid the fees. It cost me $125. I handed over my credit card without blinking. Yesterday, I would have worried about the budget. Today, I would have paid $1,000 for the weight of that seal. When Patricia handed me the stack, the documents were still warm from the copier. They were stamped in purple ink. Certified copy, Superior Court of California. The language was beautiful in its brutality. Judgment vacated. Case dismissed with prejudice. Writ of possession recalled, with prejudice. That meant they couldn't just fix a typo and sue me again next week. It meant this specific claim was dead, buried, and salted. I took the stack and walked immediately to the recorder's office. I had been there yesterday to file the fraud alert, acting on desperation. Today, I was acting on authority. I walked up to the same window. The clerk recognized me. She saw the stack of papers in my hand and the set of my jaw, and she didn't ask if I needed help. She just held out her hand. I need to record this judgment against the property record immediately. I said, it voids the grant deed recorded on November 15th. She took the document. She scanned it. She looked at the judge's order declaring the previous deed void ab initio. Void from the beginning. This will clear the cloud, she said. Her voice professional but sympathetic. We will cross-reference the document number of the fraudulent deed so that anyone searching the title will see the court order first. I paid the recording fee. I watched her stamp the document. I stood there for a moment, watching the digital timestamp appear on her screen. 12:32 in the afternoon. The lie was officially dead. If my parents tried to sell the house now, no title company in America would touch it. If they tried to refinance it, the bank would see the judgment and laugh. The property record, which they had tried to weaponize, was now a fortress with my name carved into the stone. My next call was to the sheriff's civil unit. I had sent the photo of the order earlier, but a photo is triage. I needed to ensure the surgery was complete. Sergeant Miller, I said when he answered, this is Leilani Henderson. I have the certified judgment of dismissal. I am recording it now. I need to confirm that the writ of possession has been purged from your active system. It is done. Ms. Henderson, Miller said. His voice was gruff, but there was a note of respect in it. I have updated the field deputy's logs myself. The eviction is canceled. If anyone calls us about that property again, they will be directed to the dismissal order. No one is coming to your house. Thank you. Sergeant, I let the line go dead. The physical threat was gone. The legal threat was gone. But the personal threat remained. I sat on a bench in the hallway and pulled the protective order forms out of my bag. I had picked them up on my way out of the courtroom. The judge had warned my parents verbally. She had told them that any further attempt to remove me would trigger law enforcement. But a verbal warning fades. A restraining order is forever. I uncapped my pen. I started filling out the request for a domestic violence restraining order. It fits the category. Because they are my parents. In the section for description of abuse, I did not write about hitting or yelling. I wrote about the system. I wrote, on January 10th, the respondents fraudulently accepted service of a lawsuit to evict me. On November 15th, they forged a deed transferring my property to themselves. On February 2nd, they hired a deputy to remove me from my home based on these frauds. Then I reached the section for recent threats. I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshot of the text message I had received the night before. You will lose more than a house. I attached the screenshot to the application. I wrote down the phone number. I was not just filing this for protection. I was filing it for investigation. By making the text message part of the court record, I was creating a paper trail that the district attorney could follow. I walked back to the filing window. I am filing a request for a temporary restraining order, I said, and I am requesting a subpoena for the subscriber records of the telephone number listed in Exhibit C. The clerk looked at the screenshot. She looked at the case number of the eviction that had just been dismissed. "I will rush this to the judge," she said. I knew, logically, that the number was likely a burner. I knew it might lead nowhere. But my parents were not criminal masterminds. They were desperate people who had hired a cheap notary. They probably bought the prepaid phone with a credit card, or they used a loyalty number at the grocery store to buy the minutes. They left crumbs, and I was going to vacuum up every single crumb. As I walked away from the window, I saw movement near the elevators. It was James Sterling, the attorney in the charcoal suit. He was walking alone. He was not walking with the confident stride of a high-priced litigator. He was walking with the brisk, annoyed pace of a man who had just stepped in something unpleasant and wanted to scrape it off his shoe. He was withdrawing. I knew it without asking. Reasonable clients do not lie to their lawyers. Reasonable clients do not hand their attorneys forged deeds and let them present them to a judge. Sterling had been humiliated in open court. He had been made an accessory to fraud. He would be filing a motion to withdraw as counsel before the end of the business day, citing an irreconcilable breakdown in the attorney-client relationship. My parents were now without a lawyer, without a deed, and without a shield. I didn't see them. They must have left through a side exit, or perhaps they were still sitting in the courtroom, stunned, trying to process how the world had turned upside down so quickly. I thought about Sarah Miller, the notary. I had seen the bailiff take her journal. That book was her life. It was the record of her career, and now it was evidence in a felony investigation. Her commission was effectively dead. The Secretary of State regulates notaries with an iron fist. A finding of fraud by a superior court judge triggers an automatic review. She would lose her stamp. She would lose her bond. She would likely be barred from ever holding a position of public trust again. She had done it as a favor. She had done it because my parents pressured her, because they told her it was just a family matter. She had traded her integrity for the approval of two people who had abandoned her the moment the judge asked a hard question. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't triumph. I didn't feel like pumping my fist in the air. I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt relief. It was a heavy, cold relief. It was the feeling of waking up from a nightmare and realizing the monster isn't in the room, but the door is still unlocked. It was the feeling of knowing that the system works, but only if you grab it by the throat and force it to work. I walked out of the courthouse. The sun was blindingly bright. It was 2:00 in the afternoon. I got into my car and drove home. I drove the speed limit. I used my turn signals. I obeyed every single law of the road because I was done with chaos. I wanted order. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. For the last 24 hours, it had looked like a target. It had looked like a thing that was being taken away from me. Now, it looked solid. The stucco was real. The roof was real. The land was mine. I walked to the front door. I looked at the camera I had installed in the window. It winked a tiny red light at me. I unlocked the new deadbolt. The mechanism turned with a satisfying, heavy click. I stepped inside. The air was still. The dust motes were dancing in the shaft of light coming through the living room window. My cat walked around the corner, meowed once, and rubbed against my leg. I locked the door behind me. I engaged the deadbolt. I walked to the kitchen table. The coffee cup from this morning was still there, cold and half full. The war folder was there, open to the page where I had listed the timeline of the fraud. I closed the folder. I picked up the phone and called the one person I hadn't called yet. My boss. "Hi. Leilani," he said. "Is everything okay? You took the emergency day. Everything is fine," I said. "I had a legal issue regarding my property title. It has been resolved. I will be in tomorrow at 7:45. "Good to hear," he said. I hung up. I stood in the center of my living room. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't play music. I just listened to the house. I listened to the refrigerator hum. I listened to the floor settle. I listened to the silence that belongs to the person whose name is on the deed. My parents had tried to evict me with a story. They had tried to paint a picture of a daughter who was ungrateful, a squatter who needed to be removed for the good of the family. They had used emotion. They had used guilt. They had used the weight of their parental authority. But a story is not a subpoena. A guilt trip is not a judgment. I had kept my home not because I was the better daughter, or because I yelled the loudest. I kept my home because I had the logs, I had the timestamps, I had the receipts. I walked to the hallway closet. I opened the safe. I took the certified copies of the dismissal order and the recorded judgment. I placed them in the blue folder, right on top of my grandmother's trust. I closed the safe. I spun the dial. I was safe, not because they loved me, but because they couldn't touch me. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that mattered. The victory in Department 44 was merely the ceasefire. The war ended the moment the judge slammed her gavel. But the occupation, the long, arduous process of scrubbing the land clean of the enemy's influence, had just begun. I did not go back to my old life because that life was gone. The version of Leilani Henderson, who believed that family was a safety net, had ceased to exist. In her place stood a woman who understood that safety is a product of leverage and documentation. I hired a new attorney the next day. I did not look for a family law generalist. I looked for a shark who specialized in real estate fraud and civil litigation. I found a woman named Elena Vance, whose office was all glass and steel, and whose billing rate would have terrified my parents. I sat in her conference room, laid out my war folder, and told her I didn't just want defense. I wanted to ensure that the title to my home was so heavily fortified that my parents could never touch it again without triggering a nuclear response. Elena filed a civil action for slander of title and fraudulent conveyance. Slander of title is a specific legal claim. It means someone has published a lie about your property that lowered its value or cast doubt on your ownership. By recording a forged deed, my parents had slandered the history of my home. We weren't just asking for the deed to be voided. We were suing for the damages caused by the cloud on the title. It was an aggressive move. It was the move of someone who is done being a victim. 2 weeks later, the results of the subpoena regarding the threatening text message landed on Elena's desk. I went to her office to review them. The text, the one that said I would lose more than a house, had come from a prepaid phone. My parents, or at least my father, had tried to be clever. He had gone to a pharmacy 3 towns over. He had paid cash for the cheap plastic phone and the minute card. He had assumed that cash meant anonymity, but criminals, especially amateur ones, always forget the small habits. Elena slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table. The carrier gave us the transaction data. She said, the phone was purchased at a drugstore in Burbank at 4:15 in the afternoon on February 2nd. It was a cash transaction. So it is a dead end? I asked. Elena smiled. It was a sharp, dangerous smile. No, because while he paid cash, he couldn't resist a bargain. He scanned his loyalty rewards card to get the $2 off the purchase price. I looked at the report. The loyalty account was registered to Robert Henderson. He had traded his anonymity for $2 in store savings. He had threatened his daughter's life and safety. But he hadn't wanted to pay full price for the burner phone. That detail hurt more than the threat itself. It was so petty. It was so perfectly, banally characteristic of him. He was a man who would burn down his daughter's life. But he still wanted his points. With the loyalty card link, the threat was no longer anonymous. It was a direct line from my father's pocket to my phone. It was evidence of witness intimidation and a violation of the temporary restraining order. We sent a copy of the subpoena results to the new lawyer my parents had hired after Sterling fled. The reaction was immediate. 3 days later, their lawyer contacted Elena with a settlement offer. My parents were terrified. They had realized that the civil case was bleeding into criminal territory. The notary was already talking to investigators to save her own skin. The subpoena linked my father to the threat. The walls were closing in, and they were looking for an exit door. The offer was simple. They would sign a quitclaim deed renouncing any interest in the house. They would agree to a permanent stay-away order. In exchange, I would agree to drop the civil suit, seal the record, and most importantly, sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing me from discussing the dispute with anyone. They wanted silence. They wanted to be able to go to their country club and their church and tell their friends that they had decided to let Leilani have the house out of the goodness of their hearts. They wanted to keep their mask. I sat in my living room and read the offer. The old Leilani might have taken it. The old Leilani would have just wanted the fighting to stop. But I looked at the camera in my window. I looked at the new locks. I called Elena. No deal. I said, Leilani. Elena warned, this is a good offer. It gives you the house free and clear without a trial. I don't want a trial. I said, but I don't want their silence. If I sign an NDA, I become their co-conspirator. I help them maintain the lie that they are good people who just had a misunderstanding. They committed fraud. They threatened me. I will not help them hide it. I proposed a counteroffer. I demanded a judgment, not a settlement. I wanted a court order that explicitly stated they had no interest in the property because their previous claim was based on fraud. I wanted a permanent restraining order, 5 years, the maximum allowed by law, and I wanted a recorded agreement barring them from ever filing a document against my property again, under penalty of contempt of court, and absolutely no non-disclosure agreement. The record would remain public. They refused at first. They blustered. They threatened to drag it out. Then Elena sent over a draft of the complaint we were prepared to file with the district attorney regarding the text message intimidation. Attached to the loyalty card receipt, they folded in 24 hours. The final hearing was anticlimactic. There was no screaming. There was no dramatic confession. It was just lawyers and paperwork. Judge Alvarez signed the permanent protective order. She signed the judgment quieting title in my name. My parents were not there. They had waived their appearance, likely because they couldn't bear to stand in that room and be stripped of their authority. The protective order is comprehensive. They cannot come within 100 yards of me, my home, or my workplace. They cannot contact me by phone, email, text, or through third parties. If they see me in a public place, they must turn around and leave. But the most important piece of paper wasn't the restraining order. It was the title correction. I went to the recorder's office one last time. I watched the clerk record the final judgment. It acts as a permanent inoculation. If you look up the chain of title for my house now, you see the grant deed from my grandmother to me. Then you see the fraudulent deed to my parents, and immediately following it, you see the court order declaring that deed void, fraudulent, and of no legal effect. The lie is preserved there, trapped in amber, with the truth stamped right on top of it. They can never claim it was a mistake. The word fraud is in the permanent record of the county. The investigation into their conduct moved forward. I did not have to beg for revenge. I did not have to scream for justice. The machinery of the state, once it has been fed the correct fuel, is relentless. The district attorney took the notary's testimony. They took the loyalty card evidence. My parents are currently facing charges for filing false instruments and attempted grand theft. It is unlikely they will go to prison at their age, but they are spending their retirement savings on criminal defense attorneys. But they lost something more valuable than their savings. They lost control of the narrative. For my entire life, they controlled the story. They were the martyrs. I was the difficult child. They were the generous providers. I was the ungrateful recipient. They told this story to our relatives, to their friends, to anyone who would listen. Now, that story is dead. When their friends Google their names, the court cases come up, the fraud comes up, the restraining order comes up. In the official records of the state of California, they are not listed as concerned parents. They are named parties to fraud. They can no longer play the victim because the facts are louder than their manipulation. Yesterday, I stood in the quiet of my house. The evening light was filtering through the sheer curtains, turning the room a soft, warm gold. I looked at the walls. I looked at the floorboards that used to squeak, and the ones I had fixed. I used to think my inheritance was the wood and the stucco. I used to think the gift my grandmother gave me was a financial asset, a place to sleep that I didn't have to pay rent for. I was wrong. The real inheritance was the lesson. If I hadn't owned this house, I never would have known what my parents were capable of. I never would have seen the lengths they would go to for control. I would have lived my life under their thumb, always wondering if I was the crazy one, always wondering if I really was ungrateful. This house forced the truth into the light. It forced me to stop being a daughter and start being a record keeper. It forced me to trade sentimentality for evidence. I went to the door. I checked the monitor of the permanent security system I had installed. The camera feeds are stored in the cloud now, rolling 24 hours a day. I went to the closet. I spun the dial and pulled the door open one last time. Inside, the blue folder was thick. It held the deed. It held the trust. It held the judgment. It held the protective order. I am alone in this house, but I am not lonely. I feel a profound, quiet solidity. I know exactly who I am. I am Leilani Henderson. I am independent. I am safe. And I know that if the world ever tries to gaslight me again, I will not argue. I will just open the file. I closed the heavy door of the safe and spun the dial, locking it tight. They tried to evict me with a story. I kept my home with a record. Thank you so much for listening to this story on Jane Revenge Stories. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country and let me know what you thought of Leilani's victory. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this video get recommended to more people who need to hear that truth is the best revenge.